Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So today we're covering a another topic or a bunch of topics that come under a one umbrella, which is the most humiliating slash humbling moments in our journeys. And as I was sitting here waiting for Sarah, I actually thought, wow, it's actually kind of interesting that in the past, I would have done everything to avoid talking about my humiliating moments, to be honest. I would not want to, because just, it was really uncomfortable to talk about it. And it involved a lot of shame and, massive embarrassment. I think both of us, the reason why we were kind of keen to talk about it is because actually those mm, humbling slash humiliating moments have been, at least in my experience, the most teachable, to be frank, and the most illuminating in so many ways, as much as they were also incredibly uncomfortable and painful to go through. And all I'm gonna say is like we cover sort of both because I think I think that all humiliating moments are humbling, but not all humbling moments are necessarily humiliating. So I think we're just gonna go back and forth. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, so good to be here and to chat about my humiliating moments.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny that now
Yeah,
we can sort of laugh about it, but I can
I
assure you that there was
know.
no laughter at the time. Do you know what
No,
I mean?
not at all. And I was actually noticing that about our last conversation too. We tend to like laugh a lot about all of these like humiliating moments. And that is because there's like, it's like almost like a compassionate laughter about like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like, like, because and it's not to like make that that part of me or you like in the past like wrong or bad, but just to see through it and be like, oh wow, like that's what happened, and like that was very real, and it had so much heavy and like depth to it at the time, heaviness and depth. So we can kind of like frame it in that way too, and like be able to make sure like those pieces aren't missed in this, because I think I definitely noticed that there is a something that happens when you kind of um you're not in the midst of all of that heaviness. You get through it on the other side. You can miss sometimes how much it was like a full slog to be in that moment. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that
Um,
you say that because yeah, we're sort of we're not so much laughing at or sort of in any way downplaying those moments. I would say the opposite. It's just like with everything, I don't think we need to be on an on a journey of awakening to know that with time the things that really bother us or that were really heavy or that made us go into some kind of massive, emotional turmoil with time, that it sort of dissipates and how often do we look back at the situation and we go, I have no idea what that was about or why this was so dramatic or why it was so intense and so on, right? So it's this, I think it's the same with those moments, but it's absolutely true that the most humbling moments for me were absolutely the most earth shattering and impactful, and the humiliating moments were the most kind of illuminating and teachable, really, which is why I'm glad that we talk about them, because there's richness in those moments, a lot of it, but even though it doesn't look like it in the moment perhaps. So Sarah, do you want to go with the first item on the list?
yeah, yeah. And I'll just add to that. I think I might have mentioned this, but I love the word humiliating because I'm an etymology nerd. And if you look at the root of humiliation, it is humus, which is the earth. So it's not so much of like we think of humiliation as kind of just like something really terrible and destructive, but It can be, but it's also just grounding, right? It's like grounding us into something that's common, that is shared. And I think that's the way I try to see these kind of moments too, and see where that happened. But yeah, I'll just start with kind of out of chronological order, but I'll start with this example of I think almost all of my examples are of like when I thought I was X, I was actually Y. And and I think most often for me that got revealed in relationships. So because that's just like where you get really shown like, oh shit, I can't say that I'm X, I can't say that I'm compassionate. I can't say that I'm kind. I can't say that I'm all these things. And as someone who, like I've shared, like grew up with like kind of needing the identity to be kind and service or being helpful, having those identities being shot down over time was really humiliating and humbling, and very important for me to actually have to pull back the curtain a bit more and more to see like there's other things here, not that, like we've said before, like not to like have like negative self-talk or to like go into a place where it's not productive, but to like say like, okay, I maybe there's more here that I need to hold with some compassion and care. Um, and one of those examples for me was coming out of, being in a lot of relationships, friendships, intimate relationships for years where I was like overextended, over helpful. Um, I was starting to come into like more of this spiritual, I had my big heart shattering. I had this sort of heart opening, and I was like really into like every day reading the mystics and doing my daily practices. And I got really into certain practices. I was doing some like different modalities, breath work or meditative like retreats, and I was starting to come into this sense of like, oh, like I really need to come into my own power and boundaries and like defining like what I need and like what I want, and um of course when you haven't had strengths in that before, when you don't really know where you begin and someone else ends for a while, I felt like I um was like, I'm gonna set boundaries, I'm gonna like come into this place where I'm going to lovingly set boundaries with people in my life. But I realized I was terrified. I just like didn't know how to do it. I really didn't know how. I didn't know how to do it without feeling like a bad person. Um, and and I kind of like with weak, like wobbly knees, like went into all these conversations with so many people in my life, knowing I needed to have these conversations, but like really not knowing what the fuck I was doing. But realizing like something needed to happen. Like it was very clear to me at that point, like things are out of balance. Like these relationships are not working. But I remember this very specific conversation with a friend where I just realized, wow, like this relationship is really out of balance. So much so that like I don't think I can recover this friendship. It was really not healthy. And um I, to this day, I think what I did need was to not be in that friendship anymore. But setting boundaries with that friend ended up like leading to me needing to step away from that friendship. And I realized through that process with that friend kind of calling me out, saying like, you didn't speak to any of these needs before. Like you didn't like have like all these, you didn't communicate like what you needed, what like, that this wasn't working, all this stuff, all these things that like I was suppressing within myself. And because of that, it led to having to set a boundary very late in the game and having to really like step away from that friendship and over a series of a few conversations, sort of in a sense like more suddenly than you know, than I wanted or that they wanted. And in that process, like I was completely like struck by like how I hadn't, like they were right. Like I hadn't said anything. Why hadn't I said anything? Like why hadn't I communicated? Why hadn't I been able to actually be kind by being able to communicate like my needs and what that friendship really required for us to be in a healthy balance? And it was through that friend really being brutally honest, but also like, you know, in their feedback being like really mean. And me being like, wow, like, yeah, I mean, I have to admit they're right. I was not kind. And I had this identity of being a kind, helpful, overly helpful person, right? And that was it really shook my sense of self, my like the time it overwhelmed me and it stayed with me for a while. And I think that's where, you know, some of these moments when like we have to take that turning point and decide like I'm not going to do this anymore, it can kind of come more like in our awareness more suddenly um, than the relationship has been able to like evolve or change, right? And for me, that like was very humiliating and showing me like, you know, actually by thinking you're being kind, by like overextending in this relationship, actually it was unkind because it wasn't true. It was not authentic. It was coming from this place of like needing to be needed, of needing to feel like I was doing something good. But it wasn't coming from a place of like really genuinely having the capacity to give that much, to feel in reciprocity, to feel like I was being in a relationship that felt good to me. And that was a really huge wake up call for me to, um, yeah, to just like realize how for a long time I really wasn't being truthful and that she was right. Like I wasn't being truthful in our friendship. So yeah,
Wow.
I think that's a huge thing when we've talked about that in other
Yeah.
conversations, but it gets very real, you know, this stuff like the just talking to someone about like the spiritual and the relational and like psychological, a lot of these things like they're kind of bouncing against each other as you're coming into greater awareness, right? And sometimes for me it was just like, okay, the next insight, then I'm like really realizing new things about relationship that causes me to come into more truth in conversation, um, and have to own more about my own behavior. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I'm listening to you and I'm quite honestly like feeling what you're saying in my gut, quite
Yeah.
literally. You know what I mean? And I think that there is there's something really crushing and gut wrenching when a huge part of a story of me is being dismantled, whether that dismantling happens abruptly or it's a process where, you know, sort of situation after situation or step by step, we're sort of discovering that we were kind of BSing ourselves about who we thought we were and just discovering things that don't match the whatever the lovely story is that we, you know, whatever is that we think about ourselves. And it can And I think it, I don't know. I just the kind of gut. It's in the gut. It really is. I mean, the more powerful is that identification with that idea of who I am, the more kind of unsettling it is and uncomfortable when it's being dismantled. So I can so relate to this. I was just talking, I was just thinking how I had trouble actually picking. Could there be so many humiliating moments in my journey that I didn't know what to choose from, to be honest. Um, but I'm looking at the list and I'm thinking like there's probably two situations that kind of tie into what you've been saying, although of course there were like two completely different experiences because these are our individual lives and our individual journeys. But for me, I think the first one was when I I was manipulated by someone. Um and I didn't realize that I was manipulated. Um, and one of the most kind of humiliating slash humbling moments which I will never forget because it was gut wrenching. It was like someone literally punched me in the gut. Was when I realized because it's not just that, it's with seeing that I was being manipulated, there was a kind of feeling like a victim. I was the noble victim of somebody's horrible, manipulative tactics and so on story. Which I'm not even saying it's not true. So like I'm not downplaying that bit. And I will never forget the moment when I sort of reveled in this noble victimhood, feeling really sorry for myself because I would never, this was the story. I would never manipulate anybody. I would never do this to anyone. And there was a moment at which, quite literally, it was like as though I was pointing this finger at this person constantly. And all of a sudden, that finger sort of it's as though it's flipped around and started pointing at me. And for the first time, I mean, I still have chills like in my body as I recall this moment because it was such a shock to the system because all of a sudden I just saw for the first time how I was manipulating that person too. It was actually both. It was kind of like I was actually feeding off this person's manipulations. That was another thing that was noticed. It was like there was something in those manipulations that was feeding something, giving me something. Um, but then I realized that I was manipulating as well, but in such a disguised ways and in such subtle ways that I just didn't see it at the time. But now I saw it and I saw it in detail. I saw the white lies. I saw the little games, I mean, I can't because it was such a long time ago that I can't like for those who might want to like hear more details. I can't go into details because I genuinely don't remember anymore like the sort of specifics. But believe me, there were so many situations that I saw almost almost like a live review, kind of flipping, in front of my eyes of all the ways I manipulated this person that it was absolutely crushing. I can't tell because if someone ever told me that or accused me of being manipulative, I would take it as like a massive insult. I would be appalled and I think one of the reasons why that was is because I kind of assumed that people who manipulate, I sort of do it deliberately. Like they deliberately set out to kind of manipulate, and therefore I assume that since I don't deliberately manipulate anybody, I'm not a manipulative person. That's it. Um, but it turned out to not be true. So that story of me not being manipulative came crashing down, you know, in a really powerful way, and that came alongside very soon seeing discovering basically the narcissist in me. And again, the kind of literally typical um there's a set of certain general characteristics that are used to identify whether someone it has kind of like a narcissistic disorder or whatever. Um, and I could not believe when I saw the list, and I actually realized that I could find a version of every item on that list in myself. So maybe it wasn't like a full blown disorder or anything like that, like in the way that um, if anyone studied narcissism, can relate to. But in other words, what happened is I was dealing with someone who had those qualities, who I thought of as a massive narcissist, only to find out that there was a narcissist in me as well. And that was a complete annihilation of whatever was left of kind of like self-concept of thinking of myself as a righteous, noble, better than, inherently different from whoever I despised. Not just that person, but anyone else who I judged for their character traits, their attitudes, their whatever. So it was a really, really long process. But those two moments when I saw the manipulations and when I saw those certain narcissistic kind of tendencies, vibes in me, um that I can't even describe it, but it was actually so intense and so shocking to this, like literally to the system, that I genuinely felt like a few times that I was going to vomit. Like I thought I was going to vomit because it was like I was sitting with myself and seeing and meeting myself for the first time, but like without the filters. And yeah, I don't know. That's like I would say that those were, I think it ties up kind of to what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah. I have like a lot more examples. Like I was like, which one should I go with next that relates to that?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, and it's sometimes hard to when folks say, in like more of a spiritual speech, like everything's within you, like
Hmm.
in a sense, like I realized through a lot of these humiliating moments, that means like you have the potential for everything. You have the potential to be the narcissist, to
Yep.
be the person who has explosive anger, who has like all the things you might sort of demonize as on the outside. Um, it's almost by resisting or like being averse to those things that you can get a little clue that you might have something of that in you,
Yep.
been seen or just recognized the potential of that within you. And then
Yep.
that becomes kind of a dangerous place when you're like, oh, well, I could never do that. And then it just kind of sneaks out, like you said, maybe in a more subversive, like subtle way that isn't recognized as much. But yeah, likewise, I've had the same um, similar scenario where, and I described this when I talked about my story. Um, my big first breakthrough was coming out of a relationship that I knew was very tumultuous and it didn't feel right and all these things. I didn't have language for it at the time. I didn't have, so many of the terms that we have now. But I was very confused. But I did hold this identity that like I'm the one that's trying so hard. Like I'm the one that's, doing all the right things and what's happening. And I had very much like this outer identity of being a public servant and being righteous and doing all the right things. And and as I described in the story, there was a certain point when it all just kind of came to a head where like the pressure of it was just kind of breaking me in the
Mm-hmm.
inside, just like broke something. And um and I realized like coming through that, I described it as um it was like I was in this house that was like slowly like it got lit on fire and it was slowly burning down like all the things that I thought were true were not true. And I was in this house with my partner at the time, and this fire was like burning down this house that we were creating, this
Yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah.
And the only way out of it was kind of just to like throw myself out of a window and come like crumbling down to the ground. And that's that humiliation, like the real, like kind of just being thrown out onto the ground, um, feeling so broken and so confused and so like upside down. And as someone who I like kind of went through life as like I got my shit together in some kind of way, being like traditionally successful and like I didn't ever fully feel like that was who I was, I guess, but like at least to the world, that was what was presented, right? Like that's how um I could present myself. But yeah, so just like coming to terms with like how much suffering came out of that, like how much my heart broke, how much rage came out of that opening, how much like I felt like overwhelmed with how much rage and anger that I had inside me that I didn't have any idea was there, how much deep grief was there, how much sorrow and guilt and shame when I was broken open, when I didn't have a choice anymore. Like life was just putting me under this like pressure cooker that just kind of let this crack kind of open my heart. And that heart cracking, um, didn't look like some gorgeous, beautiful spiritual awakening. It was like just
There's no bliss ride or anything like that.
yeah, there was later, but yeah, but it was my rock bottom.
Yeah.
And to this day, that's my rock bottom. Like maybe I'll have more, who knows? But that was my lowest point
Yeah.
that I've ever experienced, where I was like literally on the ground, like wailing and crying and just so confused. And I think I went into emotions I had never felt before. I felt like we were talking about like the capacity for me to be that person that had huge rage, to be the person who just was just like totally taken over by emotion, right? Just totally overwhelmed. Um, when I had been the one that was like holding it together, holding it together, being able to put on sort of like a good face for everybody, still kind of people please on the outside. And that kind of showed me too that just like that whole time, that people pleasing or like exterior, that mask that I was wearing wasn't true, right? Like that there was all of this underneath
Oh
that.
man,
There was
yeah.
so much underneath that. And it couldn't be that I couldn't hold who I thought I was anymore. It was just wasn't possible. Um, so I think in that complete like humiliation and just being helpless in a way, really like powerless and helpless. When I imagined myself to be some like strong, independent,
Oh
like,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, all the
Yeah.
things. I couldn't claim that then. I couldn't claim those things. And that allowed me then to open to the truth. Like it allowed me to say, what's really going on, like I what's really here, um, and seek help to find that out because I really didn't know. Um, so I think, and sometimes in these humiliating moments, it is so destructive or so um, just it breaks, your real sense of self or
Yep.
identity to the point where
Yeah.
you need support. Like I needed therapy, I needed
Yep.
friendship, I needed a community of support. At that time, I was really lucky a couple friends like kind of helped me like support me through that transition. But yeah, I think like it's like so much to hold often when you have this sort of ego breaks or deaths.
Yep.
Um, and there's so much that can come through um, all at once, and that felt to me just like my biggest to this day, like I'm so grateful for that moment because of how big of a breakthrough it led. Like, not, I feel like I don't know if any of this would be possible, the rest of the steps, without that big break. And it, I mean, at the time, like we're saying, it was complete misery and
Yep.
suffering and just
Yep.
pure pain, just complete pain. So yeah, I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, like, literally you just said I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and then there's part of me that does wish it on everybody as well. And I know it sounds so wrong, but um it's precisely for the reason you mentioned that I am like that moment that you describe like being broken open, just heart cracked open, like that's I can so feel into that because I call it my emotional breakdown, aka surrender, because that's because it really, in retrospect, this is precisely what it felt like. It was um I remember when I first read about a very blissless description of a journey of awakening by someone. And it was because everything I've learned or read about awakening was like about this bliss and transcendence and all of that. And I remember this guy saying that it's a complete annihilation of self-concept, and that if people really knew what that journey entails, and that it includes precisely what you're saying, that massive being broken open and kind of annihilation of everything you thought was sort of true and solid about yourself, then most people would never sign up for this. And I remember reading this and I'm thinking, he sounds a bit dramatic. Like, I was like, he sounds a bit dramatic. I'm sure he's exaggerating. And lo and behold, literally within not even weeks, I think, I was descending into like a massive dark night where literally a story after story of me was just being exposed as a lie. you know, and I just had to sit with that. And even though it was excruciatingly painful, um, it was incredibly liberating because it's also when I discovered how much it's through that pain and the falling away of everything that wasn't true or not entirely true anyway, um, that I discovered how much effort goes into upholding an image. Do you know what I mean? Like how much actual energy goes in emotional, psychological, physical energy goes into maintaining, projecting, upholding the pretense, you know, and needing to be seen a certain way, and then working at it and making sure that this image doesn't crash, you know, that it doesn't collapse, that is not questioned, that is not whatever. And and I think the other thing that came for me at the time was just seeing how, I mean, there was no denying that in a way I was a victim of somebody's actions. Let's put it this way, right? And what I mean by that, that I was manipulated and I was lied to, and you know, like for real, like there's no kind of denying of that. And I was in a couple of dynamics that were really turbulent, constant emotional turbulence, constant and when I say emotional turbulence, I'm talking like massive highs and massive lows and like nothing in between. Um, but I never asked myself what, so the focus was always on seeing myself as a victim, you know, like poor me. But I never actually asked myself, why did I stay? Like, why did I stay in those dynamics? Like, what kept me there? Like, if it was so bad and it was like so much harm was being done to me and, you know, whatever, then why did I stay? And to me, um, so when I speak of victimhood, I'm speaking of just constantly pointing finger at in one direction. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about denying facts of people treating us a certain way or us treating people. So you know what I mean? It's like just so we're clear that I'm not here downplaying the facts of various situations. But there was something so merciless, but so and painful and uncomfortable, but so illuminating when that finger turned around. And I asked myself for the first time what was keeping me there, why, you know, why I was constantly allowing to be humiliated this way or that. Why did I, you know, put up and went along and tolerated behaviors and, you know, all sorts of things. And of course, I had, you know, inevitably, I discovered that there was something, that dynamic was feeding me something that I felt was lacking in me, you know? And and therefore, and obviously where there was something lacking, there was fear. There's always, where there's lack, there's fear of something. So that was a massive inquiry. So like I'm not trying to put silver linings on those really moments that I annihilate us and put us on our, you know, right on to our knees. I'm definitely not going to put any freaking silver lining on that one. But simultaneously, what I'm trying to say is that I would honestly do it again because I know what's on the other side of this and how liberating it was to actually have the self concept and the stories of me come crashing down and have things that been inauthentic just fall away and it wasn't about becoming anyone new, actually, or a different person. It was more about just acknowledging all sides of me and all the potential, like you said, of because even if I didn't find something in me that I despised and judged from my high horse, in others, I knew I had the potential to do certain things and to be certain kind of person given certain circumstances and given different upbringing and given a trauma or whatever, and so it was liberating, mostly because I didn't have to pretend anymore that I was someone. And I didn't need anyone to see. I didn't need to be seen a certain way, but by anyone anymore. You know? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Go.
Yeah.
Like,
No, I absolutely know. I
yeah.
think it's a great way of putting it too. Like, I would do it again, which is just
Mm,
so absurd to think about. Like, at that time, I absolutely would not want to do it again. But
yeah.
knowing in retrospect now, like what it opened, the possibilities, like the ability to feel like some like so many emotions I was not able to tap into before. um, to be able to be like broken out of a limited identity, to then be able to see like, oh, like maybe there's more to me in both like the complete, and utter suffering of it, but also like there might be more in this other expansive way too. Yeah, and so it's tricky to talk about in a sense because it's not um yeah, it's not as if like, it's like everything you said has a silver lining and it's all spiritual and great and you know, not at all. But and so, and those are just hypotheticals, like who knows,
Yeah.
like it's not like we're actually choosing to do it again. Um, but yeah, there's something about that, just being able to really see like you're something else than what you thought you were, and just be with that, um, in a way that is often forced into our lives, through these really dark spaces and places. um, yeah, and I think of like, in a sense there's so much like what did happen for me after that was like this sort of bliss state that came out of that,
Hmm.
with the release of all of that energy. And it's like almost like your life force gets kind of turned on, or like the kind of ability for things to flow. And so because there was like movement now and things weren't just trapped in this like very structured identity, um, I felt like I could come alive again. Like I felt so alive coming out of that moment. So it's interesting because we talk about like there's metaphors of like kind of like the phoenix that burns and then rises again, or
Yes,
like,
yes,
there's
yes,
so,
yes.
and it felt like that.
Yeah.
In a sense, even though I did not, it's not like I had my shit together or anything like that. I was still figuring things out, still very much stumbling on some
Hmm.
of the same things again. And but there's something to, um, that very like universal human
Yeah.
journey of having to sort of break who we think we are and
Yeah.
coming into a new sense of life, like a death in that life. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's gonna come, I mean, there are multiple ways this can sort of play out for people. For some people it's some kind of tragic personal tragedy, maybe within the family. For some people it's illness. For some people For many people, it's romantic relationships, the sort of the tumultuous ones, the very turbulent emotionally ones that it gets to the point where something just blows. And again, it will be so different because this is part of what's so incredible about this, that it's so different for everybody. And I don't even know whether I really don't want to suggest that this is something that has to happen, or it's like this is part of the journey of awakening that everybody has to go through. I'm absolutely like the last person to suggest that, but I must say that of the people that kind of been through this journey, I personally have not met yet anyone who would not go through a bit of a hell at some point, one way or another. How that hell played out, how intense it was, how challenging emotionally, how long it lasted, how it came about, all those details will differ and they will be unique to each and every person. So I'm not like, I don't want to imply anything, or not to mention like scare anyone.
I'll just say to that, yeah, that I know that Thich Nhat Hanh said, like he was in an interview with someone once and they asked him if you had like a magic wand and you could get rid of the suffering in the world, would you do it?
Hmm.
And he said no. This is like a Zen Buddhist monk who, the whole point of like the Buddhist journey is to end suffering, right? In
Hmm.
theory.
Hmm.
But he wouldn't get rid of suffering. And when he said that, he said it's because really it's through suffering that we come to liberation, right? And the wisdom of knowing that you actually can't come to liberation unless you go through some suffering, right? That suffering is the
Yeah.
universal kind of principle. And like you said, it's not like the severity of that suffering and the dramaticness of it or how it looks and feels is totally different for every person.
Hmm.
And there's no requirements, for like how that's supposed to look or be. But I think there's something really beautiful in understanding that, just understanding that there's something about understanding one side of like the yin yang, being in
Mm.
one aspect brings you into another aspect.
Yeah.
And it's like through that we get to know our wholeness of both like the dark and the light aspects of who we are.
Yeah.
And so we can't just be bound by one aspect.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't even think that this is so I love that you're often sort of talking about that universal aspect of all of this, because to me, one doesn't have to be on a journey of awakening, to relate to what we're talking about. I mean, so what do you think the midlife crisis is about? I mean, for many people, it's quite literally a kind of a crisis point at which you realize, oh my God, like I have been really doing everything in my life according to my family's expectations, or according to some kind of story about who I think I should be, according to the culture that I was brought up in, or religious beliefs or whatever. And all of a sudden something happens and it comes sort of crashing down, and you realize this has been completely inauthentic, and then obviously for many people there's an urge to like look for that freedom in a very rebellious ways, doing some really crazy shit, at first. And then because there's this breaking open of wanting to break free, right? And then eventually, and usually for many people, it's like looking for the things outside to kind of make ourselves to break free, to look for freedom in things that are sort of external. But then for many, there's a shift, and they start looking sort of more inwards, and the journey starts for them, and it's not necessarily a journey of awakening. It is a sort of awakening, but we can totally remove that spiritual kind of bit out of it, and it's still pretty much about the same thing. It's just how deeply you're going to go with this, and I think that there comes a point, and I think there's something so powerful about those break open moments of that's sadly often come through tragedy, or something sad and heartbreaking, quite literally, or shocking even, that that's how it sometimes comes about. But like I said, what awaits on the other side, so to speak, is just the freedom to be human, and but in such a kind of healthy way, because that breaking open to me is a bit like a cork pops. You know what I mean? It's like it's not just the falling away of things that we've been telling ourselves. I mean, honestly, Sarah, if you asked me throughout the year before the actual day of an emotional breakdown, if I was okay, I'll be like, I'm fine. You know what I mean? I was so fine. I was on top of everything. Everything was absolutely fine. I didn't look like a person who was completely crumbling on the inside and about to have an emotional breakdown. I did not. And I really didn't think that I was. It's not like I would be lying to you. Like, I thought I had it all together, but it turned out that it just wasn't true. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I think it's interesting is I've actually this last story I told about like me coming undone and being completely broken. And what's funny is I would have said the same in a sense. Like if someone asked me if I'm okay, I'd be like, I'm fine. But there were so many indicators that I was not fine, including I developed like an autoimmune condition that I went to like every doctor I could, every specialty I could, and there was no explanation. And it was extremely painful, and it was just really difficult for this like whole year that I was going through this. And so many times, like I realize now that the intelligence of the body that's trying to say something, saying like, this is not okay. Like what's happening isn't working. We need to stop this. What's going on in life is going against like autoimmunes, like literally like your own immune system working against you. It's like you're working against yourself. You're
Hmm.
like going against the grain of your own body, of
Yeah.
your own sense of what's right. And I think all of us can relate to that in some ways. And sometimes literally it's our bodies breaking down, but we're like, oh, but I don't know what that's about. Like it's so funny that I would go to doctors and they never suggested maybe it's something in my life. It was
Mm-hmm.
like, let's test you for this and test you for that. And but yet like if anyone saw my face, like there were so many emotions just beneath the surface that were like ready to be completely released. So, um, yeah, and I think just for folks, there are folks that when, they're in these emotional, vulnerable spaces too, like it is much more serious, than maybe what
Yes.
we experience too.
Oh,
So I
yes.
always want to say, like, for folks who are going through it maybe right now or about to go through, please seek like the help you need, therapy, like whatever professional help you need, because um, just because there's the possibility of opening to, like a different sense of self on the other side doesn't mean that that's what you're gonna be coming into if you're going through an emotional breakdown right now. Like it could be
Yeah.
you're going into like a very dark period where that is going to be what you're working with for a little while. And we can't, no one can know that really. And it's all individual. And so, yeah, just that I think that's what I just listening to so many other people's stories about their spiritual journey, I always
Yeah.
felt like they were kind of skipping over like, oh, and then like, I suffered so much, but then I awakened. And then it's like, well, I don't know about y'all, but I went through years of going in
Yeah.
and out of a lot of suffering and difficulty. And speaking of what you were talking to about tragedy, like another example that I could give that I shared a bit about in my story too was about how I had a tragedy happen in my life where a friend um, took their life,
Yeah.
and I was thrown into this like dark night moment. And it wasn't just like that month. It wasn't even just those few months. It was that year, those 2 years of like going through the process of like in community too, and with the partner I was with, like, how do we recover? How do we
Yeah.
get through this?
Yeah.
And in that, um, just it was like humiliating because I thought I had my shit together. I thought like I was holding it together for my partner, for like our friends. And I mentioned like, we decided to do meditation as like kind of the one thing that felt like we could do to get support, and read Thich Nhat Hanh's books, which is why I feel like I love Thich Nhat Hanh so much, because he came in right when like we had no tools and nothing to help. And Thich Nhat Hanh's books, a lot of them talk about like tragedy and, depression and anxiety. And for someone who seems so serene and at peace with himself, he really understood and went deeply into these really like dark, nighty topics with a lot of
Yeah.
compassion and understanding. Um, and so that really helped us at the time when we were very like we're going through periods of depression, anxiety, all these things. And but yet somehow I thought I was still holding it together. And so like it's so interesting that like again, I had like these physical symptoms of like, that I was really stressed, but I was holding that somehow I was the one that was like taking care of
Yeah.
everybody. And I went to that first meditation class, and it was like a first week of classes. And I mentioned there's this class that I was driving to, and I was late. So I was stressed, and I was like, oh God, I'm so late to the meditation class. I'm just gonna, and it's like, I'm like so embarrassed that I'm late to the meditation class. Everyone's gonna like look at me when I get to the meditation class. And I get in there and I'm humiliated just for being late to this meditation class. It's a small group of people. It was like maybe like 10 people, everyone sitting silently. And I came into the class, sat down, and I just like completely started bawling, and all this emotion just fell out of me. And I was humiliated in that I was like, where is this coming from? I don't know why I'm feeling all this, because
Yeah.
I'm okay. Like, I'm fine. I felt like I was like, I'm holding my shit together. I'm not the one that needs help.
If anyone is into Friends series, I'm going to try to write in the notes which episode is with Ross, who is totally falling apart when his girlfriend Rachel is dating Joey, but he like wants to show that he's absolutely fine. It's one of the most hilarious, it's my favorite episodes of Friends, but it really speaks to like exactly what
Yeah. And he was like,
Sarah and I
I'm
are talking
fine.
like we're totally fine. We're totally
Totally fine.
fine.
Totally fine.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I like that using that word fine, period, is probably means that you're not fine.
yeah,
But yeah, yeah, I think that just, again showed me like I can't hide from my tears. They're there. There's something that I'm processing. And I didn't have a story behind it. I didn't have ideas of like why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Obviously, I
Yeah.
had been through a lot and
Hmm.
was processing a loss, but I just didn't know myself well enough to understand it all. And I think that sometimes can be really tough to be in that position of like feeling so grounded down to like, okay, I have all this suffering and um, this is here, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it came from. And like I was saying, like even those initial meditation classes were humiliating because we did body scans as like the primary like first practice and I couldn't feel my body. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, like what's this? I didn't realize that I was suffering so much that I wasn't in my body. So I didn't know that like that was a thing. I didn't know that um, you know, like what is this? Like why do we need to feel into our feet and hands? Like what like what's the point of that? Like I didn't understand. And it wasn't until like more context, more time and ability to process, more support that I could get a sense of what all of that was pointing to. And sometimes it's just like realizing I don't know anything right now, and that's that humbling humiliation moment. It's like, I just don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
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 I mean, one of the reasons why I'm so glad that we're talking about it is because for two reasons. Because for some people, this breaking open, happens out of the blue, and it's not like they've been seeking or they've been on a journey of awakening at all. Okay. But it's like how the journey sort of begins, let's say. But there's another group of people. I mean, there are plenty of groups of people, but I'm just like talking in general terms where it can get really confusing, especially when we have this first awakening or profound insight into sort of, seeing ourselves beyond who we thought we were. That is incredibly impactful and changes the way we perceive ourselves, changes the way we perceive the world in a sort of fundamental way. And then we plunge into this, then we break open at some point and we're like, what the fuck is going on? Because and that's been, I know, that's been my experience. And because I had no sort of frame of reference, I couldn't understand how, after such a powerful insight and living in almost a kind of equanimity for nearly 3 years, all of the sudden I started to suffer. And I went on and off for many years, sort of being in equanimity and completely out of it, but like completely out of it. Waves of terror, depression, not knowing who I was anymore, not wanting to do anything, not caring about anything, you know, and it can be really confusing as to like why this is happening. And I've learned recently also that if for many people who have been spiritual seekers and had those insights, and they're also part of like a community around a particular spiritual tradition, when this happens, when they break open, when they start to struggle, they feel a lot of shame and they feel like they're spiritual failures, and they won't talk to anybody about it. They either won't talk to anyone about it or they won't admit that because it's somehow shameful to be going through this, you know? Um, and there can be all kinds of things. And one of the reasons why I'm so happy that we're talking about this, because I want to say to everybody that at least the way I see it, based on, my own experience and what I've learned through listening to so many stories, that this is awakening. This is not a failure. This is not a mistake. This is not that you've done anything wrong. or that there is anything wrong with you. It's just an awakening journey in progress, so to speak. It's just going deeper. It's just going or entering a state or whatever it is your language or point of reference. It doesn't matter. But I've read recently this really interesting book. I don't know why these 10 fetters are honestly following me at this point. Like I've never been into these kind of models, but a book occurred like sort of in front of me almost, and I've read, which is incredible, but I'm not going to start talking about it now because it's like another topic. um but it was just I lost the plot now, so where I was going with it. My point is that this is um oh yeah, the person in the book said that no matter how profound the spiritual insight or awakening or whatever we want to call it, it's not going to resolve certain things. That certain things have to be addressed. And whether that is trauma, whether this is wounds, and those breaking open, I love that word, Sarah, the breaking open moments, they can only start bringing this stuff to the surface, you know. And that's why it's so confusing, because not only we're back to suffering after a profound insight, we're suffering like even more than ever before, because it's for the first time that the stuff that needs to be seen starts to come up. And whether these are some kind of stories we have about ourselves or others that need to be kind of seen for what they are, or whether these are wounds or trauma or painful or whatever it is, because again, it's going to be different for everyone. This is part of that journey, and it's not a failure. So the reason I'm saying this is because in the last 2 weeks, I had people contacting me sharing something similar, and pretty much every person said, I feel like I've done something wrong. Well, what had I done wrong? You know what I mean? And like completely beating self up over the fact that they're going through this. Do you wanna
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I
talk
was
to
thinking,
that?
I wanted to say that's why I think what we're doing here today is just to normalize, like normalize this is, if you're feeling anything on the lines of what we're talking about today, like you're not weird or strange or, you're a human. We're all human and we all go through these waves of of life that are difficult. And whether you call it a dark night of the soul or just like an emotional breakdown, or doesn't need to have any spiritual
Mm-hmm.
flavor at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's being human. And there are different, some people go, like you said, more into these extremes depending on your trauma and your background. You might
Yep.
feel things in a more like a stronger way, whatever it is. But I was just talking to a friend actually last night who's a therapist, and I was talking a bit about what we're doing. And I think one of the things that we just chatting about is, these days and traditionally there have been these like almost just by the not sharing of these human aspects, there's an implicit like almost encouragement of spiritual bypassing,
Yep.
uh, right? Which means like not coming into contact with these psychological, emotional, very human, embodied aspects. And I find like today, like I keep mentioning therapy. If you need therapy, please seek a therapist, because therapy is not, or whatever modality works for you that helps you feel supported and held and resourced emotionally, physically, somatically, um, in the body, these very like human aspects of us, the trauma, that's not separate from spirituality.
Not at
That's
all.
not, it's
Yeah.
not like a different thing.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, it's not like we can go to all of our spiritual tools to help us with these things. So it's like, I think that's the thing. Some folks may think like, well, I'll just do my mantras or I'll just do like my meditation practice and I'll, and it maybe even teachers tell us like, like use these things to address your emotions. And if it doesn't feel like those things are directly addressing the emotional body, the physical body, really like engaging and getting in touch with those things, like it's just, I think, a good inquiry to ask yourself, does this feel like I'm actually able to hold this or to be with this or feel resourced to engage my human aspects of myself, the parts of me um that are like, feeling like contracted and in pain and experiencing triggers and all these things like that, like you said, none of those things are bad or wrong or like obstacles on the journey. They're actually very much a part of a human's journey, whether it's through a spiritual awakening or just life. And it's the embrace of that, I think, that we're talking about in bringing this up and bringing up humiliation as very much a part of all of this, whether it's just a human life or it's an awakening process. But I think part of that, what you're speaking to too, is just, especially if you have teachers that don't speak to these things or kind of scoot around it a bit, or don't encourage going into them, just know that there are other folks out there who can help, like support and resource and come into those things. And there are other resources maybe that are more psychological in nature that are more appropriate. um, and that's why, I did somatic therapy for years, while I was going through a lot of my like releases and needed just an open space for someone to hold all of my grief and like all of my rage and all of the like things that I was going through. And or in communities, like being in circle with people or um, being in nature, the different things that support, because you can feel very alone,
Yep.
especially in a culture like in the West where we do shame emotions. I shame them as being unproductive. Like they're not a part of a productive person who has their stuff together and like is
Yeah.
able to kind of show up for their 9 to 5 and do what they need to do. Like emotions are very inconvenient often. And trauma.
But then you can come to spirituality and certain spiritual circles where those emotions are shamed only for different reasons. Because
Yeah.
you're supposed to be zen, you're supposed to be still, you're supposed not to have emotions, preferably, and really just be numb, which often translates to being numb for many people. Certainly has been
Yeah.
my case and the case for many people. So it's like, so it's funny how, you can um you can be in a little family culture where emotions are being suppressed and not encouraged or whatever, or you can be within the wider context, like you said, like right, or you can be within a spiritual context where those emotions are being, you feel shame because you're experiencing certain emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes that's just when we hear like certain things about like equipoises. I know that I felt this for a while. Like when you hear those terms and you're like, okay, like maybe I'm not supposed to feel then, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not supposed to feel. But actually, what I found when I actually experienced equanimity, it wasn't something I was trying to do. It was not something like a practice to do.
Yeah.
It was just what was happening when like I got to a certain part in my journey. I just was in this equanimity, there was no trying to be it.
Yeah.
And so I think that so many of these stages, it gets confusing if it isn't really explained. Like actually, for so many states where if you do feel more of this even keelness or like a sense of you can be with certain things, it's not something that you can try and force to
Yeah.
do right away. If what you're feeling is powerful, overwhelming emotions right now, that's what you're feeling. That's
Yeah.
the truth. And if we're talking about the truth,
That's the truth of the moment, the
that's the
reality of the
truth
moment. Yeah.
of the moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah.
Um, it's actually a good segue because on my list of the most humbling moments, was really recognizing the value of therapy and the value of all sorts of other modalities, because even though I was never part of any spiritual tradition or community, my first insight, my first awakening was into the nature of thought. Like I mentioned earlier, that just seeing that that we live in a thought created reality basically, and that the thought, that the very nature of thought is sort of ephemeral and transient, and it has no solidity to it. So I mean, that was like earth shattering. That was like, it really changed my life, seeing that I didn't have to, all of this, all of the sudden, my thoughts were not facts. Oh shit. You know what I mean? Whether just like thoughts about the world or thoughts about myself or thoughts about, whatever. And so it was a profound, genuine insight. But then, which, like I said, threw me into this like really long period of living in this equanimity, because just like seeing the play out of this and just having this really completely different relationship to with thoughts, that was, it was like for a long time I just didn't struggle basically mentally because I was just not kind of buying into what was going on in my head, but very naturally I wasn't buying into it. But then, like I said, gradually that equanimity started to dissipate, and I was plunging into this suffering, and without knowing why. But one of the reasons why I wouldn't know why this was happening was because I was in a constant state of resistance, which I didn't know to what was happening. And so in other words, every time something powerful or scary would come up in my experience, whether it's sensations or emotions or memories, thoughts, even, um, I would dismiss it just a story. This is just a story. This is just a thought. You know what I mean? So this is really a crucial moment at which a genuine insight turns into a coping mechanism in a very subtle way, which you don't even know that that's what's happening, but it is happening. And so I was by telling myself every time it's like, oh, it's just a thought, it's just a story. It was a constant pushback against any kind of emotional discomfort. So there was never, so because I had no ability to be with the discomfort, I couldn't see what's creating it. Like, and I couldn't see because like I had no problem with with the thoughts I was conscious of, but I didn't know that there were plenty of stories and beliefs that was sort of in the subconscious that were now coming out, that just wanted to be seen, but they didn't have a chance to come out and be revealed because I was in a constant state of resistance. And so my point is that I would not even consider therapy because, like, honestly, I would look down from my transcendental high horse, on the people who just go to therapy and they just lose themselves in the story, and they are just not seeing themselves beyond identity. So they're kind of like pinned by the story, by the past. They're just imprisoned by the story that they constantly dwell on and analyze and everything. And now there is truth to it, by the way. So it's not like it's not entirely not true, because that can absolutely happen. and it does happen. But my point is that I was completely dismissing and ridiculing those modalities in general. Like they have no, like this is completely useless. So there were people who were like looking at their wounds, looking at their traumas, who never had any awakening, were not spiritual, and that as a result had healthier relationships and healthier lives. And here I was with my profound insight, going through a complete shit show because I unknowingly, and again, I wasn't doing this on purpose, I must say, but unknowingly I was just constantly refusing to look deeper because it was just too uncomfortable. And one of the things that I've learned since is that when there is the reason why I had this kind of dismissive attitude with kind of like arrogant smirk on my face and everything whenever anyone talked about it, it was precisely because I was repressed as fuck, you know? And this is one of the things that I've noticed, that where there is no separation in the experience, there is no defense. There is no pushing against anything, you know? So if there is pushing against something in a powerful way, if there's a powerful aversion or fixation on doing or not doing something, whether it's like a like a modality therapy or whatever, that speaks volumes about what we clearly we may not be aware are actually still fighting within ourselves, you know? So I
Yeah.
really want to say this because I come across this attitude all the time, Sarah,
All the time.
all the time.
All
And
the time.
and I have a reaction of like, I cringe and like roll my eyes on the one hand because like I know this attitude because I fucking played it out for years. Years. I'm not for a few months or whatever. I'm talking years, okay? So I'm completely familiar with it. And at the same time, I have like this like also compassion because I know how innocent this is.
It's
Like you don't see
protecting
what you
you.
don't see. Yeah, exactly. You see?
Yeah, yeah.
So
It
so
protected you from that suffering for so long, right? It
it
protected you for
protected me from
years.
suffering. It protected me from suffering. So one of my most humbling moments was I've never went to therapy, by the way. I still never went to therapy, but not because I didn't want to or anything, not for those reasons. But that emotional breakdown that we talked about, the breaking open was how life, not a therapist, not a spiritual teacher, not a friend, not anybody, not a book, but life itself through this emotional breakdown brought to the surface the traumas, the wounds, the emotional pain, the rage, the anger, the everything. It brought it to, and at that point, I could not feel it. I could not be with it, you know. But it's through that experience that I realized, oh wow, okay, I can see that. I can see now why these wounds, for as long as I'm not even talking about resolving anything, it's just about seeing things for what they are and feeling the emotions that, so let's say if there was a belief that I all of a sudden I saw that I carried my entire life, then I simply saw it for what it was and I felt the emotion that was associated with it for the first time, which was heartbreaking, right? It was really painful and heartbreaking. And that's all it was about. It was not about analysis. It was not about dwelling in the past. No, it was just being with whatever was naturally sort of coming up to the surface, right? Um, and I'm not even saying that analysis is always bad because there's analysis that is actually brilliant. It's not so much an analysis, but inquiry that kind of brings clarity. So there's two sides to everything. You can go into inquiry and dig like a massive rabbit hole that you're never going to come out of, or there's the kind of inquiry that's gonna actually bring a lot of clarity. My point is that this was a massive, absolutely massive, humbling moment. The realization that whatever is not seen, it wasn't just about wounds and traumas, but also about by seeing by because those traumas and wounds finally were allowed to resurface. I was also seeing for the first time all the coping mechanisms that stemmed out of those wounds and beliefs. And I saw them for the first time in my life, you know? Um, so so yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what I wanted. This was one of the
Yeah.
most, yeah, it was a life humiliated me, and I couldn't I really ate that humble pie with pleasure. Well,
Yeah.
sort of.
Well, yeah, so just you came to a point where you couldn't dismiss your thoughts away from the suffering. Like the suffering just broke through at some point, sounds
Yeah,
like.
it just broke open, and basically this stuff was just coming out. Like
Yeah.
I think there was a moment you said that there was like it was like an avalanche. It was just one thing after, it was everything at once in a
Yeah,
way.
it's almost like we've talked about like it's like holding the line of holding this like dam. It's almost like it's a very thin line between everything coming out or just feeling what you're feeling and and just holding this front of like I'm not feeling anything. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
That damn metaphor, I used it actually in the book because I think it's precisely how I felt. I
yeah.
felt that my first awakening was what started the process of that dam, which is like resistance, basically,
Mm.
crumbling. So it's like the process of crumbling of that dam began those all those years ago. So when I talk about like the dismantling of resistance and of self-concept, that's been like a process that's been going on for years, okay? And the breaking open, the emotional breakdown was really the culmination kind of, it was just an event that basically was the last crack, and
Mm.
that's when it felt like the dam, whatever was left of the dam, it sort of collapsed in one go. And then it was just everything was overflowing, the emotions, the pain, the memories, the stories, everything was coming out in one go.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that was to me, that was, I always say that all the quote unquote or whatever transcendental moments that were pivotal. I mean, there's no denying all the powerful insights, of that nature were absolutely important. But this part of the journey, which lasted for over a year, I would say, of falling apart, basically, um, was equally important. To me, that was awakening. That was very much awakening, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm trying to, there's so much that you said there that
Yeah,
I'm just like,
I know you started saying about that you see this also like so much,
oh,
like the
yeah.
therapy thing.
Well, and I was gonna say, yeah, well, first I wanted to say, I guess like the what can come out of those times of like the depth of feeling and like I talked about, like kind of this all this life force just like being released is these bliss states. And then often with the bliss states, they're followed by more of that dark nighty kind of stuff, right? It's more of this like the feeling deeper emotions, bigger emotions, things that are like even heavier or harder to feel. And again, not to like scare people but I'm sure folks who are listening have had some experience with that, right? There's like when you just think things are going good and you're like, kind of like, oh, I'm feeling so great. I've had this opening, this awakening. And then you get brought back into something else.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
I've noticed over time of that happening again and again. It's like, oh, I think, and I can't know this for sure, but what it felt like is it's a release, which makes that you kind of feel you kind of open to all this like beauty and bliss and openness. But at the same time, it's like resourcing you for the next thing. It's like it's actually giving you enough of that capacity and spaciousness
Yep.
to hold something even bigger. And so that's one way to see or like look at it to be like, okay, there's nothing wrong that's happening by something else coming up because I definitely felt that at that time. I felt like a kind of ashamed and like you said with teachers, I didn't want to tell them like I'm kind of feeling shitty right now because I told you like last week I had a big opening. Um, but it actually is felt over time when I could see the pattern, it was like preparing me for like the next thing to feel, for the next yeah, the next thing that wanted to be held and seen. And to have that love or that bliss or that feeling of openness meet that was much more helpful, in the end. So anyway, there's just that. But then,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, on the point of yeah, seeing this so many times, what came to me too is I think you so beautifully like hit the nail on the head of like how the spiritual insight coupled with psychological patterns kind of just like meet up and create this little like this thing that can come in many forms, right? Depending on what our psychological patterns are and like what our insights are. It kind of like they merge kind of in this strange way where you use your insight to bypass more of your stuff. And I think that is, it feels to me from everyone I've talked to kind of universal. Like even if you think you're someone that's like doing your work, at some point you're going to do that maybe. And so it's something to look for or just be aware of because I certainly did that. And I shared about this, but like with my big openings, it was very heart-based. So I felt very in love with everything. But that in loveness, yeah, again,
I
it
I
was,
honestly I now call it Sarah's love fest.
I know I saw that the love fest. We could
Yeah.
all laugh
Yeah.
about the love fest.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so beautiful to be in it, and it was a huge insight because I saw the everythingness. I saw it was all everything. It was all one, and it's so beautiful to have the insight. And my psychological pattern was to do this saving, fixing, codependent
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did date a couple people while I was, going through some of these phases. And it showed me, like those relationships showed me in a very humiliating ways when I thought I was in this like love stage where I like had such great insights, that actually what I was doing is I chose people I wanted to save. Like I wanted to show them love and I wanted to bring them
Yeah.
into this
Yeah.
sense
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
love consciousness. And like we chatted about last conversation. And in doing that, it was so unloving, um, and manipulative, like you said, like to kind of like come into a relationship with someone, not seeing them as an equal, like not seeing them as someone who could meet me in love, but seeing myself as somehow more loving,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and knowing love more than the other. And then
Yeah.
played into it too, where they're like, oh, you're so loving, um, and that's why they were attracted to me is because they were kind of like putting me on a
Goes.
pedestal. And that dynamic of pedestaling or putting one person above the other is so much of what we do, just cross so many things, right? But to do that in love, right, is not loving. And to be humiliated by the fallouts of that, to
Mm.
feel like at the end of the day, I had to reckon with actually like I still had these like attachment wounds. I still had what that was driving that, to feel like I needed to be needed, to feel like I needed
Yep.
to save someone. I needed to feel like this other person kind of needed me to feel love so that they wouldn't leave, you know? And so it like really just lit up all these other aspects of myself that I couldn't deny. And I couldn't say like I was past, or like just because there's this powerful insight and definitely like literally like your sense of seeing the world is different doesn't mean, and I could speak or write about things and it might sound profound, but doesn't mean that that's embodied. It doesn't mean that
Exactly.
you're in integrity. It doesn't mean it's all the way through all of your actions,
Yes.
speech, and mind. And and I think that's so much of what, you know, is confusing along the path
Yep.
where you're like, well, insight should mean I'm completely transformed, like
Yep.
everything's done. And it's just not. That like, and I think maybe it's helpful exactly how you're putting it. Like, it's like, what's your insight and what's your pattern, your psychological, your trauma patterns, being to look at those and how they might be creating this like special little uh creature within you, because it's a very it's a potent combination to use your insight um to maybe get even more of what you're kind of like craving or needing
Absolutely.
psychologically,
Yeah.
right? It's like you're talking about with your thought, dismissing your thoughts. It could put you also in this sort of like exalted state of like, I know better
Yeah.
than
I'm
other
I'm above
people.
it. I'm above my, psychology. I'm above my yeah. Like for
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right. Which again, like for both of us, it was protecting
Yeah. Of
an
course.
aspect that was too vulnerable or
Mhm.
too ashamed or too scared to be seen. And so, like, seeing that as a protective mechanism, like you said, though, it's like it's not like a commonly talked about protective mechanism for me. Like the love one, like the to be like a really loving person is not a very commonly like spoken about way of manipulating a relationship or being in a like kind of
Literally
hierarchical.
using your awakening as a way to manipulate people around
Yeah.
you. Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And to feel like realizing that um yeah, it's just like so anything that I could there was nothing like I could say at the end of the day to say that like that was actually a loving a loving way to enter a relationship.
Yeah.
um that by not having the fundamental like um the common ground of like understanding what my wounds were, like what my things were, and then being able to see the other person and be in that mutuality. Doesn't mean
Hmm.
like, love, and there's so many different ways to think about love, but like
Of course.
I think one of the things that I took away from those experiences was it doesn't mean like we have to be perfect or we need to have all of our wounds healed or all that stuff. But like you said, it's seeing these things,
Yeah.
acknowledging them, being real about them, and being in like a mutual understanding about that, right? And being accountable to each other. And me not being accountable for my part of that, for understanding like this is my wound expressing with spiritual insight, like flair, you know, and realizing like how it was creating this other sense of like identity that was hiding another shadow that I didn't have to look at,
Yeah.
which for me and it was actually like coming into realizing I was choosing to go into relationship with some folks that like I actually didn't want to be in relationship with if I really sat with it. But I
Mm-hmm.
was going into relationship with them because I felt like I needed to share this love with people. And so I like it was almost like this kind of mission thing we talked about of like
Yeah.
trying like wanting or feeling responsible for someone's like coming into this sense of love, which is so
Mm.
bizarre
Or
now.
needing people, like we talked last time, needing people around you to understand your insides, needing them to awake.
Yeah,
That becomes like it ultimately, you never even ask yourself, why do you need them to awake? What does it give you? What does it do for you? Because it has everything to do with you and not with those people. And it's like it's just it's sort of it is left unexamined, you know what I mean? And sort of continues to sort of play out, and I think that, like I said, I think it's good. It's important to remember that really so much of this is really innocent and completely unconscious. Like
totally.
really, I'm telling you, this was one of the most humbling moments in the journey, that through this inquiry and through seeing this really um not so noble aspect of myself, let's put it this way, by seeing how completely unconscious those behaviors were, those motivations, and things like that. I couldn't help but see the same in others. I couldn't help but not see how much of what plays out with the other person, why they act a certain way, is exactly, they're just not even aware that they're doing that. You know what I mean? And again, this has nothing to do with condoning, it has nothing to do with excusing, it has nothing to do with tolerating certain behaviors. It's just seeing that unconscious element and that kind of and also the kind of both personal and very impersonal nature of those mechanisms and of the dynamic. But the one thing that I want to say before I forget uh, is I'm gonna be burned at the non-dual stake for this, but if let's put it this way, if I were part of any group around any teacher, whatever, and that group or that teacher would have shamed me or tried to guilt trip me for wanting to do therapy or exploring different modalities or going into somatic stuff, body work of all sorts, anything that I feel like it's going to be good for me, like I feel naturally drawn to doing it, I would be out of it as soon as possible, because there's a difference between having an opinion about something and not being a fan, which I think, I'm sure Sarah has a list of things she's not a fan of, and I have a list of things I'm not a fan of, right? But it's very different to have preferences and not being fan of certain things, whether it's a method or model, modality, whatever. And it's very different from shaming people or guilt tripping them or making them feel wronged uh, for trying those things. So I'm just saying, if you are one of those people that is um, being shamed for this, then I'm telling you that says volumes about the people who do that, not about you. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
get it out there.
That actually, that kind of links to this thing. I think that it's just kind of maybe a broader, I don't know, lens or framework to look at. If there's any rejection or denial of another side of things, that's always, like you said, it's like the finger pointing this way, that you say that there's like, if you're pointing this way, there's three fingers pointing the other way. Right? Like there's always like, it's always a reflection of what you're not holding. And I found that with some non-duality teachers, I've felt like shy about sharing that I did energy work, because a lot of them haven't done that. And because it's a very like, it's a kind of woo-woo-y to some people, or to some people it's very embodied. Like for me, it was very like I could feel the energies I was working with in my body. It was a very embodied
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah.
And for non-dual teachers that are doing very like thought-based inquiry, which is definitely like wasn't my path, it doesn't make sense to them, and they're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, don't do that stuff. And I heard kind of comments like that when people would ask, like, should I do energy work, or
Mm-hmm.
how about
Mm-hmm.
energy healing? And I heard a couple teachers that I interacted with in the non-dual space say, like, that stuff is just like BS, and it's kind of culty, because there are people out there who are kind of
For
culty.
sure.
There's culty stuff in every
There's
practice.
there's
Yeah.
two sides
Yeah.
to everything, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why we were chatting about last time. Like, I don't really want to give anyone advice because the thing is, like, if you've never experienced energy work, if you don't know the benefits of it, of course you're going to say, like, you're going to just go by the thoughts that come to you about what you know about it, and then kind of like give that answer. um I still to this day don't know exactly what's happening when I have done energy work. It's all kind of a mystery, but I do know that for whatever reason, like I did it for 3 years, and it helped me in an extraordinary way, and whatever that, and I think part of it for me was like when I hear about people's stories doing their kundalini awakenings, or even like the how the
Mm-hmm.
presence sort of embodies,
Mm-hmm.
um, my transition was a lot smoother than a lot of other folks that I know of. It seems maybe because my energy body was kind of cleared and changed over many years. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, but that's kind of like my intuitive sense of that. So it's like, I don't know, you can go a lot of different ways, but when someone's like sort of, yeah, rejecting anything, like for me in this moment of like being the lover, what I was rejecting and what was being reflected to me in that relationship, I was choosing sort of very rational people to be in relationship with, because what I needed and what I was rejecting was the rationality, the discernment, that aspect of me that actually needed to take a step back
Yeah.
and analyze and see, like, that psychoanalyze myself a bit and see, like, wait a second, this is my attachment wounds like coming up. Wait, let me look a little closer at this. This doesn't feel quite right. Also, I'm getting this sense like if I come out of feeling a bit that I'm choosing this, and I kind of know I'm choosing this in a way that's actually avoiding some like hard
Mm-hmm.
decisions. Like we chatted about last time, like avoiding the grief of letting this person go, of saying, like,
Yeah.
I actually don't want this. I
Yeah.
actually don't want this relationship.
Yeah.
But because it feels good, or because I want to feel this way, or want to feel like I'm this kind of person, I'm going to continue. So that's why I love like these like coming into oppositions as like a way to explore. Like if you're, say you're very like head thought sort of based in your inquiry, then like maybe your exploration is to always kind of check in and see, like, where am I missing things in my feelings and emotions and body, and like
Mm-hmm.
feeling to the body. And then vice versa for those who are more like feeling based and feeling into the body, coming into the discernment and the analytical and the rational, without dismissing it as not being useful or not being like part of that whole human experience, So, yeah.
I think to I think my point is that like one of the reasons why I love talking to Daniel Ingram and just love Daniel Ingram full
Yeah.
stop is because to me he's really the only teacher that I came across. Well, not the only, but maybe the only one that speaks so openly and so much. And he
Mhm.
himself, first and foremost, he himself is a living example of someone who never assumes that shit is not playing out anymore.
Yeah,
You know what I
right.
mean?
Yeah.
And that there's probably all sorts of patterns and mechanisms that are still at play that he might simply not be aware of. And I think this was actually that conversation with Daniel was illuminating because I think there was part of me somewhere that I
Assumed it
didn't
wasn't.
know until I spoke to him that possibly have assumed that I'm not bullshitting myself anymore about
Yeah,
things. And
totally.
ever since that conversation, I was like, that is not true.
It's not true. It's
Was
not true
like,
at
that
all.
is not that. So it was actually incredible moment because it really was a kind of a game changer in a way that was so subtle that I only kind of realized in retrospect how important that conversation was, even though it was on the sidelines. The whole thing, it was this was not what this conversation with Daniel was about, and yet this was the outcome of the conversation for me personally.
Mhm.
Where I realized that I think there might have been a part of me that assumed that I'm no longer BSing myself, or assuming that maybe I'm kind of like the sort of free of patterns or whatever, something along those lines. And so
Yeah.
it was really amazing because ever since I just don't I know I don't assume that anymore, and it's been so brilliant um to not ever assume that for as long as I'm in this bodysuit, as Frank Young says, or me. No, he calls it meat suit. That's even more
Yeah.
gross. Meat suit.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think I don't know, for me, like I just haven't been able to like this life has been like showing like every week there's different things that are like very immediate in my life. They're
Mm,
showing me
mm,
where like patterns, things that I want to like see and look at. Um, so I mean maybe we could talk about that in another
yeah.
conversation about what we're currently moving through. We just talked about like humiliating stories from our past, but I think we've chatted about this before, but like these things are ongoing.
Yeah.
And like I've said, like that was a misconception I had that karma and like patterns, these sort of things, like these, we could call them like karmic patterns or just like dynamics, like your psychology, all this stuff, somehow
Hmm.
that would be like some magic wand would like kind of cure that stuff. And but even like I realized looking at different Buddhist like experts and their like analysis of like what happens after awakening or through, when you've got all these insights, that's actually not what even the texts say. It's not even what like it's actually that yeah, you have more of this insight and clarity and ability to sit and see these things, but the karmic patterns don't end immediately. That there's actually, and there's a whole process by,
Mm.
even my Buddhist lineage, like by which you continue to work with those things. And so there is some like mythology or just maybe like a common hope and desire
Or belief. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
that
yeah.
we would be
Yeah.
cured from our humanity through the spiritual path. And that's certainly not the case in terms, at least my experience. Like I think a lot of people claim that though. I think that's also why we get confused, is there are people out there who are claiming that they've been cured from all of their unconscious patterns and their faults and all these things.
Yeah.
And I don't know all those folks personally, but I think that's why I feel like community is so important, because coming into multiple types of relationships, not just one partnership or one friend, but like a whole community of people will show you like what's actually going on, because you'll have to kind of reflect and see in all those connections different angles, because they show different ways that they see you, right?
But
And
that's the
reflect
thing,
what
Sarah.
they
It's
see.
like, and I think we talked about it last week a little bit, that it's honestly so easy to assume that you're sort of empty, because there is definitely an emptying process, and I can certainly feel it in myself that there's patterns that even the patterns that I see that play out, they're kind of empty of emotional charge, and that kind of but again, I don't want to expand to it because it's like a whole new different topic. But what was I saying? I completely lost the plot now. Um oh
You were
yeah,
certain emptying,
that
yeah.
yeah, that it's so easy to assume if you're like living this quiet life in this little place of yours, and you don't have to like worry about money, you don't have to worry about how you're gonna put food on the table. Just I'm talking like the basic human needs are, you know, no problem, that they are satisfied and so on, right? You're not dealing with a terminal or chronic kind of debilitating illness, chronic physical pain of yours or the person that you're with, right? If bombs are not flying around wherever you live, if you never go, if you only surround yourself with people that agree with you and think the same way, if
That's a huge
you
one.
if
Yeah.
you next if you actually never engage with people at all or hardly ever, or just with people that think like you, um that you're on the same page with. I mean, I could go on and on. In other words, if you don't expose yourself to life, circumstances, people, and everything, how can you possibly not, like, there's really not, there's nothing difficult in feeling zen in those kinds of where those things are lacking. Like, I mean, do you know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah.
There's nothing that can mirror anything to you. There's nothing that there's no possibility of seeing if anything triggers something, that maybe there is still something in you that plays out, and I'm not even saying, and I think that there's just the, like you said, there's just the general assumption that there shouldn't be anything playing out
Mhm.
anymore, I think is really causing a lot of kind of unnecessary stress or turmoil for people, because they have this ideal, then there's an expectation, there's like an ideal of what, let's say, enlightened or liberated person is like, that they think they sort of, so then if they do get triggered, or if something does come up, then they start questioning their insides, they start questioning their awakening, or like, whatever it is, or feel some kind of shame, or feel like I said, the spiritual failures. So I think that assumption alone, which I don't know where the hell it came from, because as we were chatting once, and even Daniel was telling me that there are stories about Buddha being reactive, being pissed off, and leaving a group of people without saying a word. Just kind of like abandoning the group because he was kind of done, talking to them or whatever. Like, just being a human, himself. And all sorts of stories about Jesus being very human, losing his shit, or whoever else we hold as up there on the pedestal as an ideal. And I really think that it doesn't serve anybody to have that ideal of that being an awakened person, enlightened person that doesn't feel, isn't human. Because if there's anything about that breaking open moment and everything else that came out of it that we talked about, and the greatest shock and discovery for me was seeing that the transcendence was in the midst of my humanness,
Hmm.
not outside of it, not when everything is not felt or cleared or whatever. It was quite literally in the midst of the emotional pain, the whatever was going on. I'm rambling now,
Yeah.
but yeah, we can definitely talk about it, because I'm so grateful that we have this conversation. I'm so grateful that I got to meet the teachers that never project this idea
Yeah.
of or that kind of ideal, not with the way they are and not in general, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think this is also where I think it's kind of just like what you and I are up to is more of this embodiment thing, right? It's more of this like being a human and being this, again, whatever you want,
Fully,
and
fully.
to be
Yeah,
fully both at the same time, to
yeah,
hold both at the same time, which can be confusing to folks because it feels like a paradox, but it's really when you're living it, it can be both happening at the same time, where there
yeah.
is this. I've been writing about this in my book that I'm writing about the conditional love and the unconditional love being in this body and my daily experiences every single day. Like
Mm-hmm.
literally, there's conditional love where I choose boundaries around who I'm going to be hanging out with and what I'm going to be doing because I'm very active in my community and I am like, I just was at like a music show last night that I helped organize, and then I was
Of
up late
course
and I was
you
like,
did.
and well, I know. So this is the thing is like, I
I
love
love
being
that.
active in my community. Even with all my insights about how I was overactive in the past,
Yeah,
like I have balance now that I feel is good for me, where I get rest, and then I also am super involved
yeah,
in ways that I feel feels good to me. And I feel like it addresses this stuff around
yeah,
like I get to see where I have aspects of myself that are coming up that I want to lean into. So yeah, and then yeah, and I feel like some folks are not on the embodiment path, right? And
mm-hmm.
they're on this transcendent path. And I think part of what I've been leaning into is like that's them doing them.
Yes.
And that's like kind of the oppositional path in a sense of like there are these two opposites that can be happening at the same time. And it feels like the dominant narrative in our cultures around spirituality and about a lot of things is this sort of like transcendent,
Yeah,
disassociative, like not coming into the body,
yeah,
not valuing like the form, not valuing nature, not valuing the things that are come naturally or more intuitive, the
mm,
things that are more um, just grounded and real in our daily lives. So it does feel like having these conversations feels like creating a space for conversation that I haven't seen, which is so like
yeah,
that's why I'm really excited too. And like it doesn't necessarily need to be like in like opposition in that like the transcendent is wrong, but it's like I think it's like what's useful right now, because like what's useful in a world full of war,
mm,
tragedy, chaos, like
mm,
bombings every day, like when we have, these huge genocides in our world, we have all these massive suffering, like
mm,
at some point, it doesn't seem like it's getting better for our collective world. If it gets even more heavy and more difficult for everyone, eventually it's kind of like what we've been just talking about. It's kind of like the collective dark nights, like the COVID, hitting the fan, everyone
mm,
having to come into their emotional bodies or being forced into those moments of being with their feeling. I don't know like what's coming, but it doesn't seem like we're going away from that trajectory of like
mm.
continually being confronted with suffering in a very like human way, in a very
Yeah,
like in a communal like there's a lot of shit hitting the fan in our societies, and it doesn't seem to be getting better in terms of more harmony or more like peace or things like that. So how do we handle these situations or how do we hold them feels like we have to be embodied. You kind of have to be able to hold your grief, hold your pain, hold the communal grief and pain to some extent. And that's why I feel like embodiment feels just in a sense, more logical or like even rational or useful to share or just to be a part of at the same time that just feels natural to me.
It's through meeting fully my humanness for the first time that I discovered that transcendence was not separate from it at all, that it was it, right? And so in many ways to me, I know that people have some amazing, mind-blowing insights and all sorts of, experiences, but and I don't mean to at all. I think it's brilliant and it's wonderful in its own way. But for me, generally speaking, if those insights into a deeper reality are not lived in this body and in the circumstances that we're living in, then they're kind of pointless to me. And again, I know that it might be misconstrued, or maybe it may sound like I'm really not dismissing this stuff. I'm just saying that awakening that's not lived, like I said, in the body, with your every cell, in every circumstances, if it's not that, then to me this is something else. I don't know what it is. That just wonderful insights, wonderful experiences, but it just has to be lived. Um and I think that that's what our conversations are trying to kind of point
It
to.
seems pretty clear to me. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wouldn't.
I certainly have more items on my list of humiliating and humbling moments, but I think we might either we can address it some other time. Thank you, Sarah, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye.